Aha! A magic move from the guys in the booth. Well, first, I just got a transmission from the radar observers on this ship. Santa Claus has been spotted. He's coming in. He'll be coming down the funnel at exactly 11 this morning. I'll get you out of here in time. We're talking about what I consider one of the wonders of the modern world, the Panama Canal. And we're doing it in 3 chapters because it's a bit much for just one story. So we're starting here at the very beginning. And the very beginning is September of the year 1513, when Balboa, leading 190 men, crossed the Isthmus of Panama. One of those 190 men, by the way, was Pizarro, the beginning of his career. They were the first to see the Pacific. But one of the men with Balboa was an engineer by the name of Alvaro Saavedra. And he observed it was only 47 miles from the Caribbean to the Pacific. And he said, we should survey this. He meant the Central American Isthmus. There might be a place where there's a strait. And if there's not, it would not be difficult necessarily to dig one. He tried to convince the king of that. It took the king a while, 20 years. But in 1534, King Charles V gave Saavedra the order to survey the entire isthmus and determine A, if there was a strait, and B, if there wasn't, where they might put one. And off he went. And what he found was that there were 3 likely places. First was up here in southern Mexico at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's the longest, about 100 miles, but the flattest. The second was Nicaragua. And it had here, whoops, let's get back to that. A lake, which would be part of the canal and make it easier to dig. But the third, of course, was Panama. The shortest. It had mountains, but it didn't have any volcanoes, and it might be a reasonable place to dig a strait. Well, it turned out that in 16th century Spain, there wasn't the capacity to do this, and in 1567, King Philip II made a pronouncement. He said, if God has not seen fit to provide a strait between the oceans, it would be sacrilege for man to do so. And for the next 2.5 centuries, Spanish silver and gold was transported across Panama on the back of mules. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. California was very loosely settled, but this was a big gold strike. A lot of people were coming. A lot of people lived on the eastern half of North America, but there was no transcontinental railroad, or in Europe, which meant that the Atlantic was in the way. And the basic rule in a gold strike was get there first. Everybody wanted to be first. The best way to be first, as it turned out, was to take a ship, land on the Caribbean coast of Panama at a town which was called Colón, walk across the 47 miles like the mules did, and then take another ship up to California. The first ship to do it was the SS Falcon out of Boston in early January of 1849. 200 prospectors got off that ship and headed for the promised land. By the way, for those of you who might be interested, this is why San Francisco sports teams are called the 49ers, because it started in 1849. Thousands followed. Hundreds of them died. It's a pestilential, very bad jungle, poisonous snakes, poisonous insects, just thoroughly unlivable. But gold is gold. But this was an opportunity for this man, William Aspinwall. He's a New Yorker, a businessman, and a year after all of this started, in 1850, he said to himself, if we had a railroad across Panama, It would make a lot of money. And he headed to Panama, and he began building the Panama Railroad. He would spend $8 million to build it. It's only 47 miles long, and in 1851 dollars, $8 million is the highest price per mile ever paid for building a railroad. But there's only 7 miles completed. Prospectors began begging him to be allowed to ride, even just the 7 miles. We'll pay for tickets. It'll be that much easier. Aspinwall and his partners were perfectly happy to accommodate them, to let them ride the railroad for 7 miles. But what do you charge for a 7-mile trip on a railroad? One of his partners had a good idea. He said, let's put a price on the first tickets so high, nobody will buy them. And then we start lowering the price. And when we get to the point where people start buying tickets, there's your price. And so Aspinwall said, okay, tickets are $25 a piece. Prospectors lined up to buy them. They never lowered the price. The railroad wound up being listed on the New York Stock Exchange. By 1860, it was $295 a share, the highest priced stock on the stock exchange. Others came as well. Once people started crossing the Isthmus of Panama, in 1850, an Englishman by the name of Dr. Thomas Cullen, member of the British Geographical Society, came and announced, I have found a route across Panama, perfect for a canal. At no point is it higher than 150 feet above sea level. Well, that was just too good to ignore. The U.S. Navy sent a ship down. Isaac Strain, Lieutenant Isaac Strain, was in command of the USS Cyane. His orders were simply find Dr. Cullen's route, mark it as property of the United States Navy. Strain landed, took 28 men with him into the jungle. They were gone for a month. 7 of them died in there from the diseases. The rest would never have gotten out if it weren't for Strain's indomitable determination not to get stuck in that jungle forever. And when he came out, he said very simply, that is not a place for a canal. That is just a hellhole of a swamp. And that put everything on hold. The start of the American Civil War, 6 years later, took our interest away completely. But in 1854, something happened which would have a great importance upon this. A retired French diplomat by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, who had served in the diplomatic corps for 20 years, met with an old friend of his, a man by the name of Mohammed Said, who had just become the ruler of Egypt. Now, Egypt was not an independent country. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire in 1854 was starting to fall apart. And if you were the man in power in a place like Egypt, rather far away from Istanbul, pretty much you were on your own. It was as if Egypt was an independent power. The two of them signed an agreement that de Lesseps would be the head of a group to dig a canal connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. It's just across the Sinai Desert, which is flat. It was just a matter of digging a long, straight ditch. Still, a big canal in an important part of the world. In November of 1869, it opened to great fanfare, and it brought the attention of the world back to concepts for Panama Canal as well. And a year later, in 1870, George Norton, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, ordered this gentleman. Well, let me double back a bit. Before I get that far, I want to talk about William Walker, because William Walker was there before this next gentleman. William Walker was an American. He had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania at the age of 14. He graduated from the medical school at the age of 19. Came down to Nicaragua. Within months, he was president of the country. And he announced he had 2 goals. The first goal was to dig a canal across Nicaragua, and the second goal was to make all of the states of Central America states in the United States. All of them southern states. All of them slave states. He knew the Civil War was coming, and they could use some allies. William Walker was executed by a Honduran firing squad in 1860. He had reached a little bit too high. This is where the Nicaraguan Canal would have been built, across the land, across the lake, and across another bit of the land. This is the same route that the Americans would later lay out for their potential Nicaraguan route. And this, of course, is the Suez Canal. When the Suez Canal opened, interest was once again focused on a canal in Panama. George Norton gave orders to this man, Commander Thomas Selfridge, Lieutenant Commander in the U.S. Navy, take 2 ships, go to Panama, survey, complete as comprehensive a survey as you can do, establish once and for all, is there or is there not a place to dig a canal? Does Dr. Cullen's Trail exist? By the way, Dr. Cullen's Trail has never been found, but he went to find out for certain. He took 2 ships, 100 men. He had 2 Navy doctors. He had 2 Navy surveyors, 5 men from the Coast and Geodetic Survey. And he took all the food they would need for 4 months, which was 10,000 pounds of bread, 7,000 pounds of bacon, 2,500 pounds of butter, 2,500 pounds of coffee, and my favorite, 6,000 pounds of tomato soup. They really liked tomato soup in the 19th century. They landed. Commander Selfridge did surveys. Aniceto Medical, who was the chief surveyor of the Navy, did surveys. Several other officers did surveys. The entire package put together was as comprehensive a survey of Panama as ever would be done. And the conclusion was, go to Nicaragua. This ain't the place. However, in 1875, fairly soon after all of this was done, this man, Istvan Tur, who was a retired Hungarian general, announced that he had put together a company, he lived in Paris, a company in Paris to dig a canal across Panama, and the Geographical Society of Paris, in coordination with him, set up a meeting for May of 1879. Any country interested in the Central American issue was free to come and debate it out. 22 nations came, one of which was the United States. And the United States spoke first, and they made it very clear. We have a complete survey. We have determined that Panama is just hopeless. We are heading for Nicaragua. One of the later speakers, oh, by the way, the question was asked, and we'll get this clear now. We'll get back to it later. When we speak of Panama in 1870, 1875, 1880, this is Panama on a map. Panama was not an independent country. Panama was part of the country of New Granada, which would later change its name and become Colombia. One of the speakers at this convention was Adolphe Gaudin de l'Épinay. He was the Baron Boschli. He was an engineer. He had been to Panama. He had seen the land. He knew what it was like. And he said, if you decide to build a canal in Panama, I urge you, dam the Chagres River, create an artificial lake, and use the water from that lake to run the locks in your canal. But the man in charge of the meeting, the head of this convention, if you will, was the same Ferdinand de Lesseps who had built the Suez Canal. De Lesseps was a very powerful personality. At this point in his life, he was 74 years old. He had married when he was young. His first wife gave him 5 children, and she died at the age of 50. He remarried, and his second wife gave him 12 more children. And he survived all that. And he was convinced he would run this new canal operation as well, and it would be what he called his ocean Bosphorus, a sea-level canal just like Suez. And so he brushed aside Gaudin de l'Épinay's suggestion of an artificial lake. He said, we are building in Panama. The Americans have a complete plan. They're not going to use it because they're going to Nicaragua, so we'll borrow their plan. It'll save some money. The Americans said no. We paid for it. We're keeping it. Use your own plan. In any case, in May of 1879, the end of May, a vote was taken, the final vote. Every French engineer in the convention voted against a sea-level canal. But de Lesseps had such a powerful force of personality that he had convinced everybody else. They all voted for it. He would run the company that did it. It would be a sea-level canal. He said, I will raise the money. It will be $240 million. It will take us 12 years, and we will have our ocean Bosphorus. He went back to Paris, and he arranged for an issue of stock. Stock issue was 6,000 shares, each share costing 5,000 francs, 300 million francs, which would have been the $240 million. Once that was all taken care of and the shares were put up for sale, he had never been to Panama. He also was not an engineer. It was time to take a look at where he was going to do this. He, his wife, and 2 of his children, including his 10-year-old daughter Fernandina, got on a ship, sailed back to Panama and into the port of Colón. It had originally been named Aspinwall for the man who built the Panama Railroad, and this was the Caribbean terminus, but the name had reverted back to Colón. A personal train was waiting for him in the station right at the port. He and his family and friends got on board, and they immediately took off across the isthmus to Panama City. It took them 6 hours to get there. When they got there, he sent a cable back to his stockholders. Easy, delightful crossing. It only took us 3 hours. The truth was whatever he wanted it to be. They then next got on a boat. They had a little 3-mile trip up the coast to the mouth of the Little Rio Grande River, which would have been the exit for his canal. They were going to turn the first spade of earth there. When they got there, that missing 3 hours had made them late. They had missed the tide. They couldn't go ashore. No matter, he said. It's a ceremonial thing only. They had a case of champagne brought up on deck. All the bottles were taken out of the case. They filled the case with sand. His daughter Fernandina struck a shiny new pickaxe into the sand. There, he said, that's the turning of the first spade. Then they drank the champagne. Having done his work in Panama, he had seen everything he had to see. He traveled back, and his next stop was Washington, D.C. And there he actually sat down with the president. The president of the United States at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes, and Hayes laid it all out for him. He said, I want you to understand that it is the opinion of this country to have a Central American canal built, managed, and owned by the United States of America. De Lesseps immediately sent the cable back to his stockholders in France. President Hayes promises to protect the political safety of our canal. His next stop was New York City. And in New York City, he was welcomed, a very lovely welcome, but Whitlaw Reid, who worked for one of the major papers, the New York Herald, wrote in his paper, we are welcoming Monsieur de Lesseps, not for what he proposes to do in Panama, but for what he has already done in Suez. His main job in New York was simple. His stock was selling very well in France. In the United States, not a single share of his stock had been bought by an American. He wanted to establish an office in New York City, a publicity office, to offset the bad press that the Panama Canal concept was getting. And to run this office, he wanted to get the American who was the most widely known and widely admired American at the time. And that man was easy to choose. It was Ulysses Grant. He had won the Civil War for the Union, and then he had served 2 terms as President of the United States. Not great terms, but he was well known. The job paid $25,000 a year, which again in 1880 was a lot of money, and Grant badly needed money. He had been frugal. He had saved his salary as a major general, and then from 2 terms as U.S. president. There was no presidential pension, but he had invested his money carefully. Turned out not carefully enough. Although it's hard to believe today, his stockbroker was a crook and had swindled him of every penny he had put in. He was broke. He decided, I will support my family by writing my memoirs. He made a deal with a publisher. The publisher was Mark Twain. And Mark Twain paid him a very, very lavish advance on which he was living. And so he turned down the job being offered because he had already been in Panama. In 1854, he had led the U.S. New York 4th Regiment across Panama on foot on the way to California. 150 of the men had died in that terrible jungle, and he never forgot that. And so he said, while it would greatly please me to be associated with something as useful as an inter-ocean canal, I will not be part of a scheme which will cost every person who invests in it every penny they put in. He turned the job down. He wrote his memoirs. He was writing his memoirs to within a week of his death from cancer in 1886. He's often thought of as a butcher because of the way he ran the Civil War, but never mind that. His memoirs are the best memoirs of any American president ever. Just a little side note. In any case, de Lesseps returned to Paris. Not a single share of stock was ever bought by an American. It was all bought in Panama, and it was a wonderful investment. If you bought a 5,000 franc share of stock, within a year, it was selling for 75,000 francs. Digging began, and the first thing they had to do was to clear a pathway 400 yards wide along the path of their canal from ocean to ocean, cut down the trees and the brush, and they went to work on the 2nd of February 1881. His work crew were laborers. They were pretty much all blacks from the Caribbean, almost all of them from the island of Jamaica. They used axes, they used hand saws, and they began cutting down the trees and cutting back all of this heavy brush. By June, they began to die. Yellow fever and malaria were a scourge that nobody had figured out a way to control. They weren't going to be able to cure it. There were no cures even contemplated, but they didn't even understand how it got spread. How did you catch yellow fever? They didn't know. All they knew was their men were dying. And amazingly, as one group would die, others came to refill their place. 25,000 Jamaicans would die during the French effort here. The Jamaican government was so appalled by that they passed a law stating that no Jamaican citizen could leave Jamaica to go and work on another island, period, which would affect the United States 20 years later. Nonetheless, the concept of what was the process whereby yellow fever and malaria were transmitted was purely a guess. And most of the guesses were that it was air rising out of the swamps, especially at night, some kind of poisonous air. You'd breathe it in, and you got sick, and you died. As a matter of fact, the word malaria comes from the Italian mal aria, which means bad air. But not everybody thought that. Josiah Clark Nott was an American physician in Mobile, Alabama. And in 1848, he had written a paper for the New Orleans Medical Journal in which he wrote, the pattern of distribution of this disease is totally unlike any pattern of distribution of gases. I greatly doubt that that is the cause for the transmission. I suspect that the transmission is being done by mosquitoes. Nobody cared. In 1881, when the dying was actually going on, a physician in Havana, Cuba, by the name of Carlos Finley, had been experimenting with mosquitoes for some time, so much so that he was known in the medical profession as the mosquito guy. Well, in 1881, he came out with a paper. He said, the mosquito I've been working on, which I call Stegomyia frangiata, today we call it Aedes aegypti, is the basis for the transmission of yellow fever. It carries it from patient to patient. Well, nobody pays any attention to somebody who's called a mosquito doctor. But he was right. He was just ignored. The work of clearing the pathway ended, and on the 1st of January 1882, the French began the actual digging. They had brought in the best equipment possible at the time. Brand new locomotives for the Panama Railroad, these new concepts of powered earth digging machines. Before this, if you wanted to dig a hole, you had to use a shovel. These machines would actually dig using power that was supplied. But the French, sadly for them, were 20 years too soon. This was just the first generation. The machines were not powerful enough. The machines didn't dig fast enough. At the end of the first year, the company that had been his contracted excavators went to de Lesseps. The company was called Curlew and Hersent. And they said, you don't need us. You can take care of this yourself. You just have to have your own chief engineer. That person can control your digging, and you're just wasting your money with us. And they gracefully retired from the scene. The truth was, they had figured out for themselves there was no way in the world they were going to be able to complete the digging in the time span that de Lesseps had given them at the price that de Lesseps was paying. They were abandoning a sinking ship, if you will. But de Lesseps just ignored that. He went out and he hired himself the best engineer he could. Now, the French engineers in the 1880s were probably the best engineers in the world. They were taught to reduce every problem to a series of mathematical formulas, solve the formulas, and you have the answer to the problem. The trouble was that in Panama, not enough was known to give you all the necessary elements to write a formula. It was mostly guesswork. No matter. De Lesseps hired his own new engineer. This gentleman was, never mind what his name is, he was French. Jules Isidore Dingler, and a very good engineer at that. But the biggest factor was that he wasn't afraid of yellow fever. No one takes the fever and dies except delinquents and drunks. Well, he became the head engineer. He arrived in May of 1883. And the first job he set for himself was calculating the amount of earth that would have to be dug. De Lesseps had never done that. He had guessed that it would be about 40 million cubic yards. But Dingler figured it out on paper, and it was 120 million cubic yards, triple the amount. De Lesseps accepted that with no question. He didn't change his time schedule. He didn't change his work budget. Dingler would just simply get it done. And Dingler didn't seem to mind either. He went to work. Because he was in a new position, they were building a new house for him, a very nice new house for him. And he brought his family over, his wife, his daughter Louise, his son Jules, and Louise's fiancée. They would live with him, and when his big new house was ready, they'd all move in together. January of 1884, Louise died of yellow fever. February, his son Jules died of yellow fever. That same month, Louise's fiancé died of yellow fever. And New Year's Eve, 1885, his wife died of yellow fever. Dingler was a broken man. He quit the job. This is the house they built for him. None of the Dingler family ever lived in it. No one ever lived in it. Dingler went home. The house sat overlooking the Panama Canal for several decades and then burned to the ground. Quiz time. This gentleman was a French stockbroker who decided in his early 40s he didn't want to sell stock anymore. He wanted to be an artist. And he became an artist of sorts. And when he heard about the Panama Canal project. He said, I could go there, I could work as a workman, I could earn enough money to buy myself a pretty little house in some tropical area on a lake and just live on fish and plants for free for the rest of my life. And so he came to Panama and went to work for the Panama Canal Company. He worked for the company for exactly 2 weeks, drew his first paycheck, said, this ain't for me, left for Martinique and never looked back. He's a very well-known artist. Would anybody care to guess who that is? Now, most people don't know. That's Paul Gauguin. And he worked on the Panama Canal for all of 2 weeks. His workers were dying, as I said. 25,000 of the Jamaicans would die. But on the upper levels, they were dying as well. His engineers, his accountants, his lawyers, his locomotive drivers, his carpenters, his steel workers. And when they died, amazingly, they were replaced. New workers came. Workers who are skilled workers. The men in the back row are just laborers. To them, it was just a matter of a weekly wage. But to a skilled worker like most of these, there's always work available, and yet when the jobs opened up, like soldiers to the battlefield, they said, they came. They came, and some of them died. There were four demons that absolutely haunted de Lesseps. And the first was the fact that he was insistent upon digging down to sea level. There is a term that engineers use, a term when you dig a path for a road through a hill or a canal, and you have to dig back a hill. You dig it back at an angle. You don't want it to be forming landslides. So you look for what they call the angle of repose, which is the angle where the earth won't move. There is no angle of repose in Panama. Apparently the earth there, because of the collision of the North American and South American continental plates, is so jumbled up that the earth moves all the time. It will slide when it's wet, it'll slide when it's dry. They never could stabilize it. The second problem they had, of course, were the fevers. They did not know how to control the passing of yellow fever from patient to patient. In the French hospitals, ants, tropical ants, would come in from outside, crawl up the legs of the beds, into the beds, and bite the patients. It was painful. And in order to protect the patients, what the workers did was they placed the legs of the bed in little saucers of water. The ants couldn't get by, but the mosquitoes were breeding right in the hospital, and they didn't know it. The third problem was the Chagres River. The Chagres River drains the Panamanian rainforest. A rainfall 40 miles away would cause the Chagres River to rise because it ran right through where they were digging the canal. Sometimes it would rise as much as 40 feet overnight. And when it did, it would wash out diggings, it would wash out machinery, it would cause all kinds of problems. They knew they had to somehow control the Chagres, somehow divert these sudden surges of flood, and they didn't quite know how. They couldn't just divert it into the canal. That would have been destructive to the canal and to any shipping that they'd ever have. They needed some kind of channels to take it away. They never could figure out how to do it. But the biggest problem was money. The biggest demon was money. By 1886, de Lesseps had spent $250 million, more than his entire original budget. He was borrowing money, paying more and more interest. He couldn't find any place to develop additional sources of income, but if he didn't get more money, he was going to run out. He was going to become bankrupt. He actually proposed to the federal government that they issue what he called a bonded lottery. This would be a lottery of bonds of 720 million francs. 600 million francs would come to him. That would be the money he needed to finish the canal. And the other 120 million francs would be prizes for the people who had bought tickets to encourage them to buy. The government had never heard of such a thing before. The French banks, who always did this sort of financing, said absolutely not. It's ridiculous, it's dangerous, we won't touch it. This gentleman, Philip Bounavaria, was one of the young engineers, very smart man, by the way, who worked for de Lesseps, and he came to de Lesseps and he said, why don't we do this? Finish the canal just as it is by putting in locks. Start running ships through, getting them to pay, and with the money that they pay, use that to continue digging until you get down to sea level. That sounded reasonable to de Lesseps, at least a basis for getting more money. First thing he did was he went out and he hired Gustav Eiffel, the finest iron engineer in the world, as his designer for the locks. Then he informed the government. They said, now, that sounds like an idea we like. And they announced that on the 20th of June, 1886, the bonded lottery would be put up for sale. They would allow applications for the bonds as early as April. When it was announced to the public, they started buying up the bonds like crazy, which is interesting because de Lesseps, who had been in so much trouble trying to borrow more and more money at higher and higher interest rates, that the stock, which, remember, had been 5,000 francs when he bought it, and 75,000 francs a year later, was now selling for $280 a share. The price had essentially disappeared. But now new buyers lined up. The entire offering of the bonded lottery was available, and it was completely subscribed for. De Lesseps relaxed. It was all going to be okay. The morning of the 20th, before opening of business in France, in Paris, in London, and several other major French cities, a telegram was received. And the news on the telegram was horrifying. Ferdinand de Lesseps has died. It wasn't true. It was a fraud. It was a lie. But all of the buyers of those bonds disappeared. When there were no buyers, the bonded lottery was never even offered for sale. Who wrote that telegram? To this day, we don't know. It could have been the banks. It could have been anybody. In any case, de Lesseps found himself unable to find any more money. And yet, in October of 1886, he left Paris and traveled to New York to be part of a celebration. The people of France were giving the United States of America a present, the Statue of Liberty. And he was there. He spoke to President Grover Cleveland. He said, we'll meet again at a scene of great triumph, the opening of the Panama Canal. But in fact, there wasn't going to be an opening, and he knew it. And on the 9th of February, 1889, he declared bankruptcy. The bankruptcy of the French Canal Company was the largest business bankruptcy in history up to that time. France was horrified. The newspapers railed. What have you done with our money? Rich investors lost fortunes. Thousands and thousands of middle-class workers lost all their retirement. This man, Edouard Drumont, published this newspaper. He had a somewhat different take on it. This supposed failure of the canal company is a scheme by the Jews to bankrupt France. He ran it every day. 5 years later, he'd run the same articles during the Dreyfus affair. Well, in any case, 105 members of the French Parliament were arrested to go on trial. Every one of their cases was thrown out. There was no evidence. Gustav Eiffel was put on trial. He was convicted and sentenced to a long period in prison. And then on appeal, the judge said, there's no evidence here. And he was released. De Lesseps himself had fallen very sick. It was probably dementia, although it might have been a stroke. Whenever it happened, he was confined to his home, and he didn't really know who he was or where he was anymore. He was hopelessly incapable of being brought into court for trial. He was tried in absentia, found guilty, but he couldn't be sent to prison because he was so old and so weak, somebody was going to be punished. It was his son Charles, who had worked on the canal. Charles was sentenced to a year in prison. His lawyers at the sentencing hearing spoke. His lead lawyer said, "Beautiful illusions. That's what these prosecutors called these efforts that failed. But humanity has to have beautiful illusions if we are ever to be great." Charles spent a year in prison. Ferdinand de Lesseps died in 1894 at the age of 88. He didn't even know where he was. Richard Harding Davis wrote sort of the final lines of this story. After de Lesseps' death, he said, "Once America has built the Nicaraguan Canal, Panama is going to be a relic, a ruin, a tragic tribute to this poor old man who was deluded into believing in a Panamanian passage." 2 days from now, we'll talk about the second chapter of the Panama Canal and a gentleman who didn't delude quite so easily, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. The second chapter is going to be called Teddy Roosevelt Makes Panama. I hope to see you all for that one. It's time to go see Santa Claus. Thank you all so much for coming today.